think Brexit and digitalisation are often two subjects that come together today, so hopefully I can unpick the latter a little bit and compete with the whole of the NEC there in terms of volume, so hopefully you can all hear me. So as we just heard there in the introduction, I work for KPMG in their management consulting team. We tend to focus on what digitalisation means to our customers, to manufacturers, to other sectors, and we really help organisations understand and pick through the journey of facing the challenge of what this means to them. So some of the use cases may be getting back market share, it may be increasing growth, it may be reducing cost. Any one of these levers is what most manufacturers are facing the challenge of today, and that's really what I want to get into in a bit in our talk. So this subject of Industry 4.0, digitalisation or the Internet of Things, synonymous terms that are heard a lot in the media, and what I want to do today is really unpick that, go beyond the hype of that, and share some insights that we're seeing in industry and within our client base, based on some of our research, and share some takeaways with you for really what this means to your organisations and what you can do going forward to leverage the power of what we're seeing today as digitalisation. So I think first it's important to define Industry 4.0. So I think quite simply, when you talk about the fourth industrial revolution, this obviously means that there were three others that came before. So going all the way back to the end of the 18th century with the advent of the mechanical loom, what's interesting is that within each industrial revolution there was a step change in performance that came about and driven by technologies at that time. And I think it would be interesting to reflect in your sector, in your companies, what you would have done differently, what your organisations would have done differently had you known at any one of these previous times in history that you were in this period of immense change. What would organisations have done differently? What would companies have done to really leverage what was going on at the time with the knowledge that this step change in performance was around them? I think this is the key thing about Industry 4.0 as it's now become known, is this idea of whatever you do, it has to be a step change in performance, and there are technologies out there that will enable that. And that's really what I want to talk about today. So I'd like to share with you this, this graph, which I think for me encapsulates the challenge that manufacturers are facing today and the reason that Industry 4.0 is becoming so prevalent and so important. So what we see here is at the bottom we're looking at product variety, and on the y-axis we're looking at volume per product. So if we go back to 1850, the age of the artisan, where products were generally made as a one-off, bespoke product for a customer in a one-off transaction with that customer. High product variety but low volume. And then we move towards the age of Henry Ford in kind of the early 1900s. And that's really when we started to see mass production driving this step change in performance in the Industrial Revolution at that time. And Henry Ford, in fact, famously said that you can have a Model T in any colour as long as it's black. And that was really a great example of this shift from the age of the artisan now into the age of mass production. This continued into the 50s, into the 60s, where product volumes really started to increase with the implementation of the mass production line. And then moving into the 1980s, let's say, manufacturers started to customize products more to really offer more personalization, but with quality and cost parameters that had come from mass customization. So in the 80s we saw, for example, the implementation of kind of online, well, sorry, not online in the 80s, but an example of this type of approach is really an online car configurator that tended to come when the internet came about. What we're seeing today, if we go forward to this point here on the right-hand side, is that really the challenge facing manufacturers today is that of globalization, regionalization, and personalization at the same time. And we like to think of today, rather than, if we reflect back to the 1850 with the age of the artisan, today is really about the age of the consumer. Customers are empowered, they're connected, they're informed, and what this means is that they expect far greater choice, far greater personalization, and far greater speed of delivery than ever before. So what this means is that from our research and certainly from our client base, we don't think it really matters whether you are a parent in a shopping mall whether you are somebody buying online or whether you are a global manufacturer buying raw materials for your supply chain, the demands from the customer are the same. And in fact, we do a global CEO survey every year. And in the last few years, number one on the agenda of issues facing CEOs has been this idea that predicting customer demand is actually the biggest challenge to organizations. And in fact, the number one barrier to innovation was seen as not really being able to forecast demand in the right way and meet this combined challenge of globalization, regionalization, and personalization. So, if we think about how organizations can really address this issue of getting closer to the customer, we take a very simplified view of a traditional value chain in manufacturing, where suppliers feed materials into a factory, the factory makes a product, and the product is then shipped to the customer. In a traditional sense, materials flow one way and information flows another way. So generally information goes from the customer backwards, and materials flow from the supply chain through to the factory and through to the customer. So one way that organizations can really face this challenge of getting closer to the customer and really being able to predict demand much better is to think of the traditional value chain as circular. And sharing data between each key stakeholder in this chain is really one of the techniques that manufacturers are now using. And the enabler for all of this is really the Internet of Things. And I think this is the key point, is the Internet of Things today enables this idea of real-time data transfer that is enabling a step change in performance for manufacturers, particularly to help them get closer to the customer, really forecast demand, and then pass this all the way back through to their supply base. And there are various terminologies that we're hearing around each part of this. So the idea of a demand-driven supply chain, where the supply chain actually becomes very, very agile and uses data from both the customer and the manufacturer in real time. And then an example of this is in the automotive industry, for example. The age now of connected vehicles, one of the drivers for that is to really understand customers better and being able to manage that customer journey much closer and own that customer relationship. So the effect now that we're seeing this have on business models is quite interesting. So today what we're seeing in organizations, in particularly manufacturing, is using these techniques to improve operational efficiency through better asset utilization, improved worker productivity conditions, and really in operational cost reduction. You know, we can talk about cobotics, we can talk about machine-to-machine communication, and these are really, really in the early stages. But as we move forward to the mid and the long term, what we're seeing to address this challenge now that we've just discussed in the previous slides is really a dramatic shift in business models to service and then eventually to outcome. So some examples of this. If we think about a service-based offering, again, automotive is a great example of this. Pay-per-use business models now, and Zipcar is a great example of this, where instead of buying a car maybe, customers are using this for an hour or two, using a product in a one-off use case like that. Product service hybrids. So Amazon Echo, I don't know if anybody has the Amazon speaker, but this is a great example of a piece of hardware that's being sold now to enable a ongoing customer relationship and order through Amazon online, but connecting by voice with a speaker that's in your home, maintaining that customer relationship and increasing customer engagement. Additive manufacturing now is supporting this as well, being able to offer personalized products in a much shorter time to their customer. And then if we think longer term to a more outcomes-based scenario, so mobility as a service is a great example of this. You may think of non-traditional companies such as the Department for Transport for London. You know, in a future state where a customer is paying for an outcome which is to get to a destination, how does that impact organizations like Ford, who have historically been selling a product to a customer in a one-off transaction? So what we're seeing is now that this enables new connected ecosystems. There is this idea of industry blurring, where organizations such as Nike or Adidas may be considered as a sports clothing company, but they're now getting into the realm of application development in order to maintain that customer relationship. And this is also enabling the circular economy, where organizations recycle in this continuous value chain that we saw in the previous slide. So there's another really nice anecdotal one here. The reason for the laughing there in the picture is I read recently about a comedy club in Spain, in Barcelona actually, that is charging by laugh instead of by entrance. So they're using facial recognition software to determine how many times you laugh throughout the performance, and then you pay based on that. So that's an example of paying for the outcome of being entertained. If you're not entertained, you don't pay. So there are just some examples from different sectors on how we're seeing the impact of digitalization of Industry 4.0 on other sectors, and particularly on business models. So I wanted to now focus on the UK automotive industry and what this means to the automotive manufacturing sector. So we've seen some of the techniques, some of the drivers that organisations are using to get closer to their customer. We've seen some of the impact on business models, on how this is changing the value chain, but in particular to bring it into the manufacturing realm, and the automotive industry in the UK is a great example of this. We did a survey last year with the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders that looked at the impact of digitalisation on the automotive industry in the UK. And the objective was to lobby government around to help organisations with some of the challenges in realising digitalisation, but also get a real feel from industry what is going on and why organisations are doing this. What are some of the drivers for organisations at a company level to embrace digitalisation? And the results were quite interesting. So what we have at the top here in the bubbles is a kind of a summary of a survey that we did of SMMT members, which was over 50 companies that responded to this, and we asked them to rank in order of influence what they see as really being the main improvements that can come around through implementing digitalisation in their organisation. So this goes through from forecasting accuracy improvement through to increasing productivity in production planning, for example, reduction in machine downtime, reducing time to market, again, which corresponds with the challenge that we saw in the first slide, reducing inventory, reduction in maintenance costs, costs of poor quality, and interestingly enough, productivity increase was last on the list. Now, we've subsequently found out that, this was actually released at the beginning of the year, we've subsequently found out that this low number for productivity increase is really because organisations at the moment are focusing on pilots when it comes to digitalisation. There is organisations are very cautious in their deployment of technologies because they're uncertain about the ROI. But we think that there's a lot more value to be had in terms of productivity. So what we did is we did our own analysis behind that, supported by conversations with the organisations that participated in this study, and we considered the implementation timescales of a lot of the enabling technologies behind digitalisation. So we've heard of some of them before: additive manufacturing, machine-to-machine communication, use of machine learning to help kind of organise assets on the production floor. And we looked at what the expected time frame was for all of these technologies up until about 2035, and then we looked at what we forecast to be the impact on the UK economy in the automotive sector as a result of implementation of these technologies and digitalisation. And we looked at the impact on the manufacturer, the supply base, and on the wider economy. And the result was that we forecast an impact on the UK economy of an additional 74 billion by 2035. And we see how this is broken down into annual economic benefit here. So what's interesting now, as personally as I have been on this journey for over a year now, is seeing the shift in perception of the art of the possible, and organisations being very slow to kind of move because of not being certain of an ROI, into really focusing on this number and leveraging some of this to really drive a difference. And that's what I'd like to focus on now. So the way we as KPMG break down Industry 4.0 is really into 6 dimensions. That is around strategy, business models, that is technology, where we consider all of the technologies, some of which I've just discussed on the shop floor, for example, within an organisation to optimise processes. Finance and risk management, how to invest in what at the right time to be sure of that return. Looking at the impact on employees and competencies within an organisation, what skills do you need for the future and how do you leverage your organisational capability to attract that right talent. We looked at systems and processes, so what systems does an organisation have in place that can best capitalise on a lot of the technologies within Industry 4.0. And then we looked at how services are offered, how the customer really gets that product out to market and capitalises on that information and that relationship with the customer. So we took this one stage further. We did another exercise at the beginning of this year that culminated in a report that we've just released, actually called Beyond the Hype. And we went out and we spoke to 26 global manufacturers around the world, and we used our kind of 6 dimensions and a structured framework to sit down with them We spent a morning interviewing key stakeholders in the organization, and then we spent the afternoon visiting the factory floor and looking at what some of these companies are doing to kind of leverage a lot of these benefits. And we used, the purpose of that was really to understand what the leaders are doing, what good looks like, and therefore help our clients to better understand what they're aiming for, what their performance ambition should be. So within this benchmarking exercise, we then took these 6 dimensions and we started to rank the companies that we spoke to in order from pioneers through to novices. And what I want to do is share with you now is some of the outcomes of this survey. So this was done over 3 or 4 months at the beginning of this year. And what you can see on the right-hand side is the output of these kind of 6 dimensions ranked from level of maturity, 5 being highest, 1 being lowest. And some interesting things came out of this. So firstly, we differentiate between what we call smart product and smart factory. Within our framework, within our assessment, we were able to draw out key areas that focused on organizations leveraging knowledge about their product to offer a better product to their customer, or switch to a more servitized business model, as we saw in one of the earlier slides, or are they optimizing their processes just within the factory? And what we found is that the majority of organizations are at the moment much more focused on optimizing processes internally within the factory than actually focusing on optimizing the product to the customer, which is one interesting insight. And again, which you can see on the left-hand side here. Then if we look to the results itself, something else interesting came out from this. If you look at the top line, the dark blue curve here versus the dark orange curve, we noticed that organizations are much more focused at the moment on the strategy and their business model and thinking how this can be impacted by digitalization than actually the services and the networks excuse me, side of it. So there's this consistent gap between ambition and thinking and actually reality of distributing this across an organization, across a value chain, and realizing some of the benefits of digitalization. So some of the conclusions from this study were really kind of threefold. So recommendations for organizations. If we talk about what the leaders were doing, what we learned about that grey box up there. So the leaders are really doing 3 things. They're really leveraging digitalization at scale. And what this means is they're looking for opportunities outside of their organization, outside of basically all across their value chain to leverage new technologies and to get closer to their customer. They're optimizing both smart product and smart factory at the same time. So if I can bring this to life with an example from my client base, we're currently working with an industrial manufacturer who has a large installed base of products, heavy machinery products around the world, and they asked us to come in and look at their processes internally and optimize their lead times to deliver aftermarket products out to their installed base, to their customers. So we worked with them over a period of several months. We analyzed all of their processes internally, and we said, yes, you can optimize your lead time. You can reduce the time it takes to manufacture a product by optimizing processes internally. You can get that product out to your customer quicker. Great, and we think there's an opportunity there. But what was most surprising is that this organization didn't know where 80% of their install base actually was around the globe. So they are trying to service a product base around the globe that they don't have as much knowledge of as they originally anticipated. So now, as a result of that, we're working with them to implement very simple sensors within their products, both retroactively and proactively going forwards, to understand better what those products are doing around the world and therefore predict demand and really maintain that customer journey over the lifetime of the product. And that's an example of an area where organizations may not think to look first, but there's a far larger piece of the pie to be had than just focusing on processes internally. So that's how organizations can scale. Secondly, integration. We've spoken earlier about integrating the value chain, and this can be challenging in many sectors. So if we take the automotive sector, tier 1 suppliers, for example, find it challenging to be sandwiched between an OEM and their own supply base, especially when a lot of their spend and a lot of their processes are dictated very often by the OEM at the top of the value chain. So one organization we're working with in tier 1 automotive supplier is actually out proactively educating both their customer and their supply base on the benefits of digitalization, using RFID tagging within their products, for example, to share information across the value chain and overcome a lot of the barriers that are currently being being considered by OEMs, such as protection of intellectual property, cybersecurity concerns as you share this data across the value chain. This particular tier one supplier is out there proactively really driving this change. And that's an example of how a different approach is needed rather than selling a traditional product or a traditional service. And then thirdly, I think that the third most important thing was around skills. So the leaders are those that are out there selling the fact that their organization is now technologically advanced, is embracing digitalization in Industry 4.0 to attract the next generation of talent. In fact, our study with the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders last year highlighted 4 key new roles that will be required for manufacturers going forwards, all the way from data scientists through to cybersecurity experts, to really leverage these technologies and bring them to life within an organization. And it may be that manufacturers, instead of looking to traditional, looking to the manufacturing sector to recruit the next generation of talent, they may be looking to the gaming sector, they may be looking to the fintech sector, which are both very strong in the UK, in order to attract this next generation of talent. So I think, to summarize, I'd like to leave you with 5 key takeaways. So firstly, be bold within, when embracing digitalization and when putting together your strategy for this. And it's important to remember that being bold means very different things for different organizations. For some organizations, being bold may mean how you shift from selling a product to selling a service, which comes with a whole raft of challenges, particularly in the core competence of an organization. For other companies, being bold may be just breaking down traditional silos internally and sharing information better. Attracting next generation of talent and how organizations leverage their capabilities to attract non-traditional sectors. This may be what being bold is for many organizations. So this is really personal to a company, but the point is you need to be bolder than ever before in this. Secondly, you need to think big. Industry 4.0, as we defined it here, cannot really be bought. We've learned that it's more a journey. And we've learned that often a lot of collaboration is actually required across different sectors. So again, the automotive industry now, we're doing quite a lot of work with Ford at the moment on their vision of Mobility 2030, and they're finding that to really do that, they're having to work with the insurance sector, they're having to work with the finance sector, they have to work with government much closer. And it's this idea of collaboration and looking for opportunities in non-traditional areas that is really driving performance so far in Industry 4.0. On that word performance, thirdly, we recommend starting with performance, not technology. So it's very easy to have a conversation about digitalization and think about, oh, I have a raft of different technologies that I can use. How do I decide which ones will give me the most benefit? So we recommend that on any transformation program that we do, we start with performance. What is the performance ambition of the organization, and then which technologies are required to achieve that performance ambition? Very often organizations have, or may think they have, more data than they can ever use. They have data from many different sources across the organization, many different processes. But very often when you come to identify the specific data sets that are required to achieve a performance ambition, there is something lacking there. And that's where we have to work together to look at, are the sensors in the right place? Are you looking at the right KPIs? How are they measured? Planning ahead. Again, this is where the skills element comes into it. What does your organization look like in 3 years' time, in 5 years' time? What does your organization look in 6 months' time? And this is really taking a lot of the things that we've discussed here, particularly focusing on the opportunities in the 6 dimensions that we've highlighted, to say, okay, what can we do going forwards in the short or the mid-term? And then finally, assess yourself. Most organizations find it very, very helpful to have this idea of baselining and to really understand where they sit versus their competition. So what we do with organizations is we work with them to firstly define where they want to be, and then secondly, we see where they are. We have this assessment, we have a framework that helps organizations really put themselves against other manufacturers, confidentially, and then saying, okay, there may be opportunities here beyond those that organizations expect within these 6 dimensions. And then we work together to bridge that gap, and it's that roadmap that is very key to success. You have to have a clear vision and then a strategy and a roadmap to get there in order to really bring all this together. So hopefully that's been helpful, and thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure to be here.